You feel the stone first, cold, slick with resin against your knees as hands force your head down. Torches gutter along the chamber walls, smoke tasting of pine, ash, and dried copper. Drums answer your heartbeat, merciless, relentless. Above you, carvings climb the limestone, gaping mouths of gods, tongues like knives, shell-set eyes that glint when the fire breathes. An obsidian blade catches light on a nearby altar, black as spilled night, so sharp the priest handles it like whisper. Sweat crawls. It hides nothing. The air is crowded with human fear and memory of blood in stone. A rope bites your wrists. A chant rises and falls as if measuring you. You search for a face that might say your name and find only masks, jaguar, serpent, death. Then the realization arrives with quiet cruelty. You aren't here to watch. You are here to complete the pattern cut into these walls, a debt paid in breath and silence. In the flicker you see bowls waiting, painted with flowers. They call it offering. Your body hears another word, inventory. Outside, the pyramid lifts into flawless sky, astronomy and artistry married to power. Inside, the gears of something older than mercy begin to turn. If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The more voices gathered here, the deeper we can dig. Across centuries, from the Petan forests to the Yucatan plains, the Maya raised cities like sermons in stone and orchestrated punishments not as chaos but as systematic policy, braided with theology, kingship, and war. This story is built from the empire's own echoes, Friar Diego de Landa's stark descriptions and testimony, murals at Bonampak that stage prisoners beneath musicians and nobles, stairways and altars at Chichen Itza aligned to ritual calendars, cenotes yielding bones, pigments, and ritual objects under archaeologists' lamps. These are not lurid rumors. They are procedures named, scheduled, and remembered. Ritual chambers designed to turn human fear into offerings and order. If you're ready to see how bureaucracy married belief, stay with me. We now peel back the layers step by step. The moment we leave the surface grandeur of Mayan civilization, the shadows lengthen. To understand the horrifying punishments carried out in the king's ritual chambers, we must begin with the way victims were chosen, categorized, and transformed into raw material for religion. Conquest and tribute were only the first act. The true theater of power was what came afterward, the sorting. When armies returned from campaigns, or when tribute was demanded of vassal towns, the captured did not remain faceless masses. They were systematically divided. Age, gender, and condition were decisive. Children were siphoned out for rain ceremonies, where their tears were seen as conduits to Chalk, the storm god. Diego de Landa, the Spanish friar who documented these practices with both revulsion and precision, wrote of infants lowered into sacred wells, their cries rising with the scent of burning copal. Archaeologists at Chichen Itza later dredged those same cenotes, uncovering the small bones of boys and girls beneath layers of jade beads and obsidian knives. What had once been whispered accounts became sedimented proof. The classification extended further. Adolescent girls, particularly virgins, were reserved for fertility rites. Nobles considered their blood and breath a direct gift to Ixchel, goddess of childbirth. These girls were not executed immediately. They were paraded, clothed in ceremonial fabrics, adorned with temporary beauty. The ritual chambers became cages of anticipation, where the victims knew that each braid in their hair, each paint mark on their face, was simply the wrapping of a sacrifice. Chroniclers describe this preparation in chillingly bureaucratic tones, listing 15 maidens, aged between 14 and 20, adorned for the festival, as though noting livestock in an account book. Warriors were not spared. Captured fighters, especially those of renowned bravery, were often saved for the most spectacular chamber rituals. To the Maya, a warrior's blood was fiery fuel, proof of cosmic strength. These captives endured public torture before their execution, forced into ritual ballgames where survival was impossible. Losers were not simply defeated, they were ceremonially dismembered, their heads displayed in chambers beneath Sampantli skull racks. The chamber itself, carved with serpents devouring human figures, became an extension of the battlefield, except the rules here were divine and unrelenting. This sorting was not chaotic cruelty. It was systematic psychological warfare. Imagine being a mother whose child is plucked from her arms for the rain gods, while she herself is marked for later burning. The cruelty lay not only in death, but in the forced witnessing of separation. Chroniclers record scenes of families torn apart deliberately, parents bound and positioned to watch their children's selection, unable to intervene. The punishment began long before the blade fell. The ledgers that tracked these selections are almost unbearable in their detachment. Numbers tallied alongside goods, cacao, feathers, maize. In one colonial record, friars transcribing confiscated Maya codices noted an entry that listed 60 captives, 15 for chalk, 20 for the maize goddess, remainder for the sun festival. The way human beings were assigned, in neat columns, stripped them of names, turning them into quotas. This is where the chamber horrors truly begin, not with the bloodletting itself, but with the administrative stripping of identity. Once sorted, captives entered the slow machinery of ritual preparation. Marches through cities turned them into living warnings. They were displayed in chains, paraded through plazas, often starved to weaken resistance. At times, they were force-fed intoxicating drinks laced with hallucinogens before being confined to chambers. The goal was not merely to end life, but to orchestrate an experience, a theater of submission that reinforced the king's divine authority. The chambers themselves were designed to heighten dread. Archaeological digs in Yucatan reveal stone benches with restraints carved into them, grooves for blood to flow, and mural fragments depicting bound captives painted blue, the color of sacrifice. The color was more than cosmetic. Blue marked a human as no longer an individual, but as sacred currency. Once painted, a captive's fate was sealed. Punishments varied according to the ritual's purpose. Heart extraction, perhaps the most infamous, was conducted on raised stone slabs inside the chamber, with priests holding down the victim as an obsidian blade pierced the chest. This was done not in haste, but in rhythm with chanting, as though the chamber itself demanded a performance. In some cases, the extracted hearts were burned in braziers, the smoke believed to carry the essence skyward. Chroniclers described the silence that followed, a moment of cosmic recognition before the body was dragged aside. Other punishments carried symbolic weight beyond death. Drowning in cenotes symbolized direct communication with the gods beneath. Archaeologists have found layers of female skeletons weighted with stones at the bottoms of sacred wells. Their bones testify to rituals where victims were flung alive into water as living messages. The ritual chamber often acted as the staging ground before such drownings, where captives were dressed in finery, then marched in solemn procession toward their watery grave. Some punishments went further still. The ritual of flaying, where the skin of a captive was removed and worn by priests, was considered a reenactment of agricultural cycles, the shedding of life for renewal. Inscriptions link this practice to Xipe Totec, a deity later emphasized in Aztec rituals, but with roots traceable to earlier Maya concepts. Imagine the psychological weight, watching your kin reduced to a garment of sacred theater. Chroniclers recount nobles seated in chambers to witness these acts, applauding the spectacle as proof of divine favor. The chamber was not only a site of physical punishment, but also of humiliation and forced participation. Captives might be compelled to perform ritual dances in costume, mocked as living gods, before being executed. One Spanish observer noted the grotesque irony of seeing a bound man crowned with feathered headdress paraded as a mock king before his throat was cut. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were systemic rituals designed to invert human dignity into spectacle, reinforcing the supremacy of kings and gods. Every detail served the machinery of fear. Priests often euphemistically described these acts as flowering the gods, a phrase that cloaked brutality in poetic disguise. But beneath the metaphor, the reality was industrial-scale dehumanization. Captives became raw resources, their individuality dissolved into ritual necessity. And the chambers, with their carvings and grooves, functioned as both stage and slaughterhouse, blending religion, politics, and terror into one. Pause for a moment and consider, to the Maya, these punishments were not cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were obligations, timed to the movement of stars, calculated like taxes. To the victims, they were an endless nightmare disguised as holiness. To us, reading the records and unearthing the bones, they are a reminder of how civilization can polish atrocity into ceremony. What made the punishments in the Mayan king's ritual chambers most horrifying was not merely the violence, it was the way terror became structured. Repetitive, almost industrial. The chambers did not operate as chaotic arenas. They functioned as carefully managed engines of control, where each victim passed through stages of erasure, humiliation, and destruction that were as predictable as they were inescapable. The next stage after selection was psychological dissolution. Captives were often renamed, their identities overwritten with divine titles. A child seized from a village might be called Ixchel's Flower, a warrior rebranded as Jaguar's Prey. These euphemistic labels, inscribed into ritual chants, stripped away personal names. Archaeological discoveries of painted glyphs in Bonampak show processions where captives' titles were written not as human names but as symbolic placeholders. A boy was not Hanahau, but offering to the storm. Such rebranding was psychological warfare, severing ties between victim and family, between human and history. Some captives endured prolonged humiliation inside the chambers before death. Reports describe forced piercings with obsidian thorns, tongue, lips, and genitals punctured until blood pooled onto bark paper. The blood was then burned, a gift to the gods, while the captive was mocked by nobles. This was punishment not only for the body, but for dignity. Chroniclers tell of mothers forced to watch as children were made to bleed in silence, priests calling it purification. One Spanish friar observed that women selected for fertility rituals were sometimes kept for days, subjected to cycles of piercing and intoxication, before finally being cast into cenotes. The ritual chamber became a liminal space between identity and oblivion, where torment was measured not in minutes, but in stages. The economic incentives driving this cruelty cannot be ignored. Warriors who delivered more captives were rewarded with honors, feasts, and rights to land. Festivals demanded quotas, and commanders were expected to meet them. Ledgers preserved in colonial transcriptions reveal chilling notations. 200 brought for maize festival, 80 for fire god, remainder sold. Victims were counted alongside cacao, jaguar pelts, and obsidian blades, commodities in a system that treated flesh as currency. If mortality was high during transport, it was deemed acceptable loss. Priests and kings measured human worth in numbers, not names. Transport itself was another layer of punishment. Captives marched long distances, bound in chains or neck yokes. Survivors tell of hunger, exhaustion, and the deliberate breaking of spirits before arrival at temple cities. Archaeologists examining bone trauma on skeletons from ritual deposits have noted stress fractures consistent with long marches and heavy restraints. By the time these victims reached the chamber, they were shadows of themselves, starved, dehydrated, beaten into submission. Inside the chambers, intoxication often blurred the edge of death. Priests administered balshe, a fermented drink mixed with hallucinogenic plants, to captives before rituals. Some accounts describe victims staggering, confused, laughing, or crying uncontrollably as they were bound to altars. To observers, it seemed as though the gods had taken possession. In reality, it was the final cruelty, an enforced distortion of consciousness before the blade. Victims were made to participate, in body if not in will, in their own destruction. One of the most grotesque chamber punishments was the mock coronation. Selected captives were dressed as kings, painted in ceremonial garb, given feathered headdresses, and forced to sit on thrones within the ritual chamber. Musicians played, nobles feasted, and at the climax, the mock king was dragged from the seat and executed, his body displayed as a warning. Chroniclers note that this inversion of dignity was deliberate, turning the dream of power into a nightmare of humiliation. The chamber became theater, where human lives were staged and erased for political messaging. But perhaps the most enduring horror was the way families were weaponized against themselves. In some regions, oral traditions recall parents scarring their children to make them less attractive to raiders, cutting faces or breaking bones in desperate love. Villages whispered of these chambers, of what awaited, and mutilation became a shield. This, too, was punishment, not inflicted by kings or priests, but forced into the choices of common people living under fear. To survive meant to harm one's own, to disfigure what one cherished most. It is here that the system reached its most insidious depth. Terror reproduced itself within households long before soldiers arrived. The chamber's horrors were remembered and recorded because they were designed to be public memory. Murals depict nobles watching sacrifices in balconies, as though cruelty were entertainment. Accounts describe drums beating in rhythms that echoed through cities, so that even those far away heard the announcement of another life ending. The chambers were not hidden places. They were stages where the destruction of human beings was performed for entire communities to witness. And yet, beneath all this spectacle, bureaucracy reigned. Captives were tallied, punishments assigned by ritual calendars. On certain festival days, the chambers filled with victims waiting their turn, each marked with paint according to purpose. Blue for water sacrifice, red for fire, white for renewal. The color coding alone reveals a systematic cruelty that reached the level of bookkeeping. Archaeologists recovering pigment residues in chamber stones have confirmed the palette still clinging to cracks centuries later. Each color told a victim what god they belonged to, what fate awaited, and none of it was accidental. This is why the Mayan ritual chambers remain among the most horrifying in history. They reveal not merely cruelty, but the merging of religion, politics, and administration into a system that consumed humans with cold precision. Captives were not just killed. They were processed, categorized, humiliated, and repurposed until nothing remained but bones at the bottom of cenotes and murals on plaster walls. If this chills you as it does me, subscribe now and comment your thoughts below, because what comes next defies comprehension. We've seen the sorting, the humiliation, the drowning and flaying, but the true revelation lies in how these chambers were not aberrations, but the very machinery of empire, designed to perpetuate itself through fear. And so, as the chamber doors close behind us, we step closer to the climax of this nightmare, the revelation of a system that turned punishment into policy, sacrifice into economy, and human life into the currency of kings. The further we descend into the Mayan ritual chambers, the more we see that these punishments were not isolated acts of brutality, but the gears of a vast machine. Religion was the fuel, politics the driver, and human lives, the raw material consumed to keep the engine turning. Each chamber was not simply a stage for death, but a cog in a larger calendar-driven bureaucracy of blood. Festivals demanded bodies. The great celebrations of renewal, of harvest, of cosmic balance, they required quotas, sometimes hundreds of victims at a single event. Chroniclers like Diego de Landa marveled at the great multitude offered during equinox festivals at Chichen Itza. Archaeologists excavating near the Temple of the Warriors uncovered rows of altars and chamber foundations, designed not for occasional rites, but for throughput. The structure itself reveals intent. Benches lined with grooves to carry blood away, floors reinforced to bear the weight of multiple captives. This was not improvisation. It was engineering for sacrifice. The machine required a constant supply. Wars, raids, and tribute systems existed in part to feed the chambers. Maya rulers organized seasonal campaigns, often timed to precede major festivals. Scouts identified valuable targets, young warriors, virgin girls, children from rival villages. Raids were calculated not only for military gain, but for human resources. Chroniclers describe emissaries sent to tally how many bodies neighboring lords could deliver, like officials collecting taxes. One chilling account notes, the lords of Mani were required to send forth 30 maidens and 40 warriors, besides gifts of maize and feathers. Flesh listed alongside grain. Inside the chambers, the punishments themselves reinforced this machinery. Heart extraction was swift, but it was rarely solitary. Victims were processed in sequences, one after another, the rhythm of drums guiding priests like overseers of an assembly line. A 16th-century observer wrote of a festival where the hearts of 4 boys were cut in succession, laid smoking on the altar, and their bodies cast aside as the drums did not cease. The imagery is industrial, throughput measured not in goods, but in lives. Other punishments were calculated for spectacle. Mock coronations, ritual ball games, prolonged humiliations. They reinforced the message that no one, however strong or noble, escaped the system. Captives who once commanded armies were reduced to costumed puppets in chambers filled with jeering nobles. The message was clear. Kings held the monopoly on death, and only the machinery of ritual could decide its timing. The cycle perpetuated itself. Each festival fed the legitimacy of kings. Each quota met reinforced divine authority. The more elaborate the chamber punishments, the stronger the aura of control. And as generations grew up watching these ceremonies, what should have been shocking became normalized. Parents whispered to children not of love or protection, but of the dread of blue paint, of the sound of drums that meant captives were being prepared. Pause here and consider. Entire communities reshaped their lives around this machinery. Families scarred their children to make them unfit for selection. Villages surrendered without resistance at the mere rumor of being chosen for festival tribute. Fear was so deeply ingrained that the chambers did not need to consume every life, just enough to ensure the rest lived perpetually under their shadow. If the chambers were the gears of the machine, then the breeding cycles and calculations of priests were its most chilling mathematics. Chroniclers and archaeologists alike point to evidence that some captives were kept alive for months, even years, fattened and prepared for sacrifice at specific calendar events. This was not mercy, it was inventory management. The Maya calendar, intricately tied to astronomy, dictated when gods required renewal. Festivals aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary movements. Priests, reading the heavens, scheduled not only ceremonies but the punishments within the chambers. Victims were fed or starved according to ritual timing, intoxicated or kept sober depending on symbolic purpose. The chambers thus became warehouses of human life, waiting to be converted into offerings. Accounts tell of children raised specifically for sacrifice, taken at such a young age that they never knew another fate. Archaeological evidence supports this. Bones of adolescents in sacrificial deposits show signs of long-term captivity, malnourishment, and deliberate preparation. Imagine the psychological void of a child growing up in the chambers, never called by their birth name, always known as offering to Chak, or flower of the sun. The punishment was not just death, but the denial of ever living freely at all. Numbers reveal the cruelty most starkly. Chroniclers estimate hundreds killed during major festivals. At Chichen Itza's sacred cenote, divers recovered the remains of over 200 individuals, spanning men, women, and children. This was one sight. Multiply across the expanse of Maya cities, across centuries, and the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. It was, in effect, industrial-scale dehumanization. For every 100 captives taken, perhaps 10 survived long enough to reach a festival. 9 in 10 were consumed by transport, starvation, preliminary torture, or execution in minor rituals. Priests recorded this not as tragedy, but as efficiency. Even justice became perverted into punishment, as spectacle. Nobles accused of betrayal or commoners charged with crimes could be sentenced to chamber rituals. Instead of prisons, they had altars. Instead of trials, they had humiliation and death. In one case, recorded by a Spanish friar, a man accused of theft was pierced with thorns across his body, made to bleed into bowls, then drowned in a cenote while his neighbors were forced to watch. Crime and punishment blurred with religion, turning the chamber into court, theater, and execution ground all at once. Perhaps most disturbing was the normalization. Children grew up watching festivals where victims were paraded, painted, humiliated, then slaughtered. They learned that this was not aberration but order, the natural rhythm of society. Priests described sacrifices as feeding the gods, a phrase so repeated that it became common speech. By adulthood, these children no longer questioned the chambers. They accepted them as one accepts the sunrise, the rain, the seasons. This was the ultimate punishment, not just the torment of those who died, but the corrosion of those who lived. A civilization taught to see human life as resource, to view suffering as sacred necessity, to believe that intimacy itself, blood, tears, breath, belonged first to the gods, second to the kings, and never to the individual. And when we step back, the realization is chilling. The Mayan kings' ritual chambers were not places of chaotic cruelty. They were factories of faith and fear. machines designed to turn human beings into instruments of cosmic order. The horror was not in their excess, but in their efficiency. When we step out of the chambers and back into the sunlight, it is tempting to breathe with relief, to tell ourselves that such horrors belong only to the past. But the truth is more unsettling. The Mayan kings' ritual punishments remind us how civilizations, no matter how brilliant, can normalize the unthinkable when belief and bureaucracy fuse into one. These chambers were not accidents of cruelty. They were institutions, architecturally designed, ritually timed, socially reinforced, and that is what makes them most horrifying of all. Look closely at the ruins today. The pyramids stand tall, their staircases aligned with equinox light, their acoustics engineered to echo the call of the Quetzal bird. Tourists marvel, cameras flash, guides speak of astronomy and artistry. But beneath those stones lie cenotes filled with bones, murals where captives kneel in chains, and ledgers preserved by friars that detail human lives reduced to quotas. The splendor and the terror are inseparable. Each feathered headdress in a museum display is shadowed by the cries that once filled the ritual chambers. The scars of these punishments remain, not only in archaeology, but in memory. Oral traditions in villages still whisper of children taken, of parents mutilating their own in desperate defiance. The genetic traces of captives from distant regions persist in populations today, silent reminders of forced movements and ritual consumption. Trauma outlives architecture. It lingers in silence, in superstition, in the stories that elders murmur when the fire burns low. And what lesson do these shadows leave us? That civilization itself is fragile. When unchecked power weds itself to divine justification, when kings and priests convince generations that suffering is sacred, then atrocity becomes not exception but expectation. The Mayan chambers stand as warnings carved in stone, that beauty can mask brutality, that rituals can sanctify horror, that entire societies can be trained to see cruelty as natural order. The ledgers survive, the bones endure, the murals still speak. They remind us that remembrance is resistance, that to tell these stories is to restore dignity to those stripped of names, to drag truth from the shadows where kings tried to bury it. If this history unsettles you, subscribe and share where it struck hardest in the comments below. Together, we will confront the next buried truth, not to gawk at suffering, but to ensure it is never forgotten. For only when we remember can we deny the chambers what they hungered for most: silence.